it will be best, Professor Spencer, if you answer the governance two questions, which I think has been clear to you.
Yes, the fiscal situation, as the Governor says, is crucial for the success of monetary policy to achieve its objective. I mean, in the early 80s, or when the reforms were taking place that I was talking about, the fiscal deficit was quite large, but probably not as large as you were talking about, which is like 8 to 9% of GDP. I think it was more in the order of, 5 or 6% of GDP. And then during the latter part of the 80s, the government moved to reduce the fiscal deficit. So fiscal policy was working in the same direction, if you like, as monetary policy. They were both sort of consolidating. And there were significant fiscal reforms as well as the monetary reforms. So in some ways, that helped to make monetary policy effective, but it also had quite a contractionary effect on the economy at that time. Now, I think the second part of the Governor's question is, can the central bank still achieve its objective if the government continues to run large fiscal deficits? And I would say, well, it probably can achieve it, but it becomes more costly and more difficult, a more difficult problem. And because if the government is taking all the savings in the economy as well as external savings, then as he said, you're going to be running a large fiscal deficit. You're probably going to have a current account deficit. You're going to have a situation where probably the exchange rate might be declining, but interest rates increasing more than they would otherwise increase if the fiscal situation was under more control. So there's no doubt about it that you can have an independent central bank, but if the fiscal situation is not under control, it's going to make the job very difficult.
Thank you, Professor Spencer, for those clarifications. For once, we are running ahead of time. So if I can ask Dr. Roshan Pereira, who was also a former central banker, whether she wants to make any comments or ask any questions.
Thank you. I just have a question. I think they are all related. Basically, you ended your presentation by talking about Reserve Bank of New Zealand in an inflation targeting framework. But I think in 2019 you sort of changed the framework, and you have moved to a more sort of a flexible inflation targeting framework. So my question is really, how was that process how did you come about that process to revise the mandate of the central bank from pure inflation targeting to this flexible inflation targeting? And related to that is basically, I think also there's a process by which the government, you said the government basically sets the mandate really, or it's not the mandate, the objectives in terms of economic objectives. And I think there too you have sort of included certain objectives relating to, I think earlier it was to do with sort of the welfare of the economy, relating to sort of exports, creating jobs and high wages, reducing inequality and poverty, but that was also amended to include the housing sector at a particular point in time to ensure financial stability. So the second question is, how did you sort of come about that process to include a broader mandate? And the third question is really in terms of, you have a public consultation process, I think, to revise the mandate of the central bank's mandate sort of every 5 years. How does that process take place, and what has been your experience? How has it helped to sort of refine the mandate of the central bank, or the monetary policy framework of the central bank? Thank you.
Well, thanks for that question. That quite a broad question, very relevant to the implementation of monetary policy. The first point I would talk about is what this flexible inflation targeting, because the change in 2019 that you mentioned is a shift from the single price stability objective to two objectives, or the dual mandate of price stability and maximum sustainable employment. And that dual mandate, as you know, is what the Federal Reserve has, many central banks around the world have that dual mandate. But that is different, in my view, to flexible inflation targeting, because right from the beginning in New Zealand, when we just had a single objective of price stability, it was still, we called that flexible inflation targeting, because what that meant is that we're not trying to achieve price stability every quarter or every year. You know, we have now the inflation target is 1 to 3% with a 2% midpoint. So you're aiming on average over the medium term to be inside the target range, with a preference to be in the middle of that target range. But from time to time, you're going to be outside of that range. And it may be quite sensible to be outside of that range. For example, when you have a big oil shock, for example, then you're not going to try and offset that initial price shock from an increase in the price of fuels. Sometimes you just have to let that blip flow through, and you move outside of the price stability target for a period before moving in the medium term to get back, make sure you're back inside the range. That's what I call flexible inflation targeting. It's the medium term perspective on the inflation target. The other issue is just whether you have a single price stability objective or the dual mandate of price stability and employment, maximum sustainable employment. Now, the reason that changed in New Zealand in 2019 was there was a change of government, and the government's election, the new government, the current Labour government, the minister had this preference to change monetary policy to introduce the dual mandate. Now, so and that happened. That was a political decision. It was, in the election platform of the Labour Party before they came to government, and they introduced it. There was no consultation as such. It was just a political act. But the question you have to ask is, well, has it really changed monetary policy? And I'm not sure it really has. I mean, you can debate this for hours, and whether it really makes a difference whether you have a dual mandate or a single mandate. It's probably more important, the governor and the approach and discipline in the central bank. Now, my preference would be to have the single mandate, the price stability mandate. If you're going to have the dual mandate of maximum sustainable employment and price stability, I think the price stability should have a priority over the employment objective. And that is the case in the Bank of England, for example, where they say, maximum sustainable employment subject to achieving the price stability target. In other words, it's really saying that you're never going to be able to achieve maximum sustainable employment if you don't have inflation under control. So inflation, price stability for monetary policy still has primacy, in my view, even under the dual mandate. But, you will find different people argue, one way or the other. I think I would not have changed from the single price stability objective to the dual mandate because, when you're operating monetary policy, you have price stability as the objective, but you're always having regard to employment, having regard to volatility in output, and you're not going to chase price stability and cause damage to employment unless it is really necessary to achieve your medium-term objective. So the remit and the legislation makes it clear that you have to have regard, and obviously you have to have regard to what's happening in the economy. Anyone can, to just achieve price stability with having no regard to the real economy is a simple task, but it's not a realistic objective. And so the remit and the legislation say you have to have regard to employment, volatility, and also financial system stability and efficiency. These have regard to objectives, but they are secondary objectives. Now, I think the final question you had was with regard to the reviews, and what is being reviewed now at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is the remit for monetary policy, which is the statement of approach to monetary policy, which sets out, for example, the 0 to 3% target. It says the CPI is the index that you shall target. You shall have regard to financial stability. You shall have regard to volatility in interest rates, output, employment, etc. It sort of fleshes out the monetary policy objective, so to speak. That's the remit, and that's what's being reviewed every 5 years with an external consultation. And they've just had, and I gave some comments, for example, a submission on that remit review recently for New Zealand. But the dual mandate is not actually up for grabs. That's not in the terms of reference of the remit review because the dual mandate is in the legislation. It's probably getting a bit complex, but as you know, you have your basic objectives in the legislation, and then you have some of the more detail fleshed out in the remit, which is reviewed by the minister, every so many years. But you don't need to go back and change the legislation, change the remit. So for the time being, dual mandate stays in the legislation, even though there are many people who'd say, well, maybe it would be better to go back to the single price stability objective. One of the suggestions I made in the remit review was to give priority to the price stability objective, to continue to have the two objectives, but to have priority for price stability. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I've tried to tackle it, and I hope that made some sense.
Yeah. I have one additional, I'm sorry, I'm coming back, just to share your experience in terms of the loan years of institutional independent central bank, and also in terms of the basically maintaining the independence in operations. Have you seen, your experience, so in your experience, say several last few decades, have you seen any attempt of the government changing finance ministers, changing governments? Has there been any influence in terms of appointing governors, members of members of the board, members of monetary policy committee, or at least under the provisions, finance minister can change the agreement with the central bank. And has that been happened, changing the finance minister agreement has been changed, or in terms of any kind of a political influence of the operation of central bank? In your experience, if you can share just to see how it practically worked in your situation. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. The remit that I mentioned used to be called the Policy Targets Agreement. So in the earlier version of the legislation, in the 1989 Act, it's a requirement that the minister and the governor agree to the policy targets agreement, and they'd sign it. So whenever there was a new minister or a new governor, they would do a new PTA, it was called, and then they both sign it. And so this would happen, as I say, from time to time. And the potential was for it to have some political influence, but over many years, it didn't have a lot of political meddling or anything that would really disrupt the central bank from its pursuing its price stability objective. Now, in the most recent version, where they changed in the new legislation, where they've changed to the dual mandate, they now got rid of the PTA, so it's no longer signed by the governor and the minister. It's now the remit. So the remit replaces the PTA. And the remit is more just a one-way direction from the minister to the bank saying, this is how I expect you to operate policy. And I think that in a way is a little bit more open to political influence. And Dr. Sarath's question actually about the change that was recently put in the remit regarding house prices. And so the minister revised the remit. This is last year, because our house prices were going through the roof and causing a lot of trouble as a result of the very easy monetary policy in the COVID period. And, like as in many other countries, house prices were going up rapidly as people borrowed at very cheap interest rates to buy houses. And the minister said, well, I'm going to change put in the remit, you need to have regard to house price inflation. It was a new thing, but the way the wording was in there was no actual requirement. It was purely sort of have regard to or monitor or report on house prices. And so while it appeared to the public, the minister could say to the press conference, well, look, I've asked the Reserve Bank to be careful about house prices. In fact, it had no real requirement for the Reserve Bank to have any other regard for house prices than it had previously. So it was a bit like window dressing. That's my personal opinion, and I've actually said that in the submission that I made on the recent Remit review. So I say the same thing in my submission. But so that's an example where there is some sort of political element coming through in the reviews of the remit. But by and large, I'd say it's been a fairly clean sort of process in New Zealand.
Thank you for that clarification. If I now can ask Professor Sirimal Abhiratna, who is the chairman of the newly established Stakeholder Engagement Committee, which is an advisory committee to the central bank, whether he would like to make any comments or ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Spencer, for the wonderful presentation and giving the experience of the New Zealand Central Bank regarding monetary policy conduct. I have a very simple question and then a comment that would be related to the question as well. The question is what were the challenges during the first 10, 20 years that the central bank has to face that after you initiated this 1984 reforms, the challenges. So I don't think you had smooth sailing, and was it actually a smooth sailing during the first 10, 20 years by just looking at the dashboard and making the fine tuning here and there. Why I ask this question, because when we had also had this transition from control economy to an open economy in 1977, and today we can't explain it as an open economy. It's neither open nor closed. There are a lot of confusions around this idea, so that the most important assumption, most important lesson that we can learn from the New Zealand experience would be related to the assumption, the underlying assumptions of the conduct of the monetary policy rather than the monetary policy, because you explained nicely about the simple functions of the central bank and the limited operations confining to the central bank objective, the price stability, and the environment that you had prepared in your country, in New Zealand, enabling the central bank to conduct that monetary policy independently. And our system is, as also Dr. Sarath mentioned, is quite complicated. And the link between Treasury and the central bank, the government and the central bank, that is quite complicated issue here. And also the governance issue, that is quite complicated here, because we never know what is changing tomorrow. I'm actually, to give you an example, I'm heading a Industrial Policy Formulation Committee for 3 years now. It was supposed to be 1 year. And I was briefing to 4 ministers so far. And I also have to brief tomorrow to the 5th secretary who came recently. What is it all about? So there is no consistency, there is no predictability in this system. So we are operating in an entirely different environment. So that's why I said the underlying assumptions are the most important lessons that we can learn for Sri Lanka. Secondly, I also like to mention about when I draw the parallels between New Zealand system and the Sri Lankan system, I think there has been no country which have escaped from any kind of crisis, so that there have been budget deficit, current account deficit, and so on. But the crisis that Sri Lanka right now in is much more than that kind of normal disturbances to the macroeconomy. And in that crisis, as Governor also mentioned, that of course central bank has an important role to play, conducting the monetary policy and also conducting the taking care of the government debt. But at the same time, I also understand this, in this crisis, the central bank role is very limited, because it's a structural issue in the country where we haven't done enough to generate enough foreign exchange. So it is basically a structural problem which is outside the central bank operation, but central bank has been involving in this problem as a major institution responsible for the problem. So this complicated system, conducting a simple monetary policy operations is quite a challenge. I think that's why I asked you the question that how smooth it was sailing during the first 10, 20 years when you change the monetary policy. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your comments actually regarding all these questions, and I learned quite a lot, and I also learned from your presentation about the wonderful experience, wonderful achievements that the New Zealand has done during the first 10, 20 years. Thanks.
Thanks for those comments, and I certainly appreciate that Sri Lanka has a very different situation today to what New Zealand faced in the early 80s. There are obviously some common elements, some issues that sort of look similar, but I don't pretend to say that this is some identical situation, and you have a complex, multifaceted issues to deal with and to get on top of. And the monetary reforms, I think, are important. I think they're important piece in the jigsaw puzzle. And as the governor said, I think it's clear, and I looked at the new monetary bill. I didn't, not in great detail, but it looked pretty sensible to me. And so, sometimes you want to go, you know the direction to go in. It's a matter of getting implementation and making the whole thing work in the political and economic environment of your own country. In terms of the experience we had, in the first 10, 20 years, it was certainly not plain sailing. There was a lot of volatility and shocks along the way. I think overall it has been quite successful in the sense that low inflation was achieved in the early 90s following the reforms period that I discussed. Inflation really stayed close within the target range, moving occasionally outside of the target range, but that's acceptable under flexible inflation targeting. And that's been the case right through to the present day. And it's only that, in the last few quarters where inflation has really got a bit out of control due to very easy policies in 2020-21 combined with the oil shock and the COVID shock. It's only very recently that inflation has sort of got a bit out of control and inconsistent with the central bank's objectives. But I would just say that some of the difficulties along the way have involved going back to the times when there's been very large fiscal deficits have been a real problem, and that was raised earlier with the question about the fiscal situation, and also often with regard to the international trend of interest rates. So if New Zealand's trying to tighten policy, as was the case, for example, in the period prior to the GFC, and if the rest of the world's interest rates are staying very easy, in other words, if the local and the external monetary policies are out of sync, then that can cause problems. And in particular can cause a lot of pressure on the exchange rate in the floating exchange rate environment. And so when there are these distortions, whether it's either the fiscal issue or an external issue, then that can make it a much more difficult challenge to keep on track with monetary policy. But that's part of the game, and it's very rare that it's totally smooth sailing. So in that sense, Sri Lanka is not alone.
I also happen to be the economic advisor to the president. So I'm seeing this every day. It's not going to be easy, but we have to do it. But I've seen countries, other parts of the world, my last incarnation, many other countries were in terrible situation, were able to come up. Needed a good leader, needed the population to understand what was at stake, and needed some outside help as we need, and they came through. I've seen countries like Ethiopia going from starvation and complete fall in society to come up again. Of course, now they are back at it again, unfortunately. But many countries have done that. You know.
I know that, and all I'm saying is that
If I can now turn to the central bank, anybody? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Governor Spencer, for very nice session on experience sharing and very educative. My question is simple, and it is related to your reference to central bank budget being approved by the minister. And I'd like to ask you whether it includes the monetary policy implementation costs and the other costs like currency issuances, or it's only the administrative costs that you're referring, because we know central bank's expenses, majority is not the administrative expenses. Majority of the monetary policy implementation costs, like sterilization. Thank you.
Yes, the 5-year funding agreements, which are effectively the central bank's budget, was for administrative costs. In implementing its monetary policy function, its financial stability function, and its currency function. But not all of the currency costs of the currency manufactured costs, I think, were sort of separate from the budget. It was basically operating expenditure that was covered by the budget. So then, at the end of the year, the bank would see how much money it had made from its balance sheet, and typically, because of the structure of its balance sheet and the seniorage that it was earning on the currency issue, it would earn roughly 300 million New Zealand dollars per annum, and then it would take the budget amount that had been allocated and approved by the minister would be taken out of that, and then there'd be a sum to retained earnings to maintain economic capital within the bank, and then the remainder was paid to the government as a dividend. So there was, so as you say, this budgeting process would basically influence how much of the bank's profit it could keep at the end of the year to meet its operating expenses. And that was held under the control of the minister. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Before we come to this side of the room, anybody else from the central bank staff? Yes, Director Economic Research, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, very much for a very interesting.
Can you lift the mic?
Yeah. Thank you, Deputy Governor, former Deputy Governor, very much for very insightful presentation. My question is basically in terms of sequencing that you mentioned. So I'm share some experience in Sri Lanka. So what we have done is we have imposed some stricter fiscal management measures far back in 2003 by introducing the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act before we introduced the central bank legislations, reforms. But what we saw was like since the introduction, we've been postponing those targets every year. And but on the inflation front, we've been able to manage inflation within the 5% range, as Governor mentioned. So the question to you is it really the legislations that we are talking of for really the people who hold in the positions and the credibility and the commitment to achieve the objectives. Thank you.
Well, I can't comment on the specifics of Sri Lanka, but in a general sense, if you're saying, well, you need to get the fiscal deficit under control in order to have an effective monetary policy, that as we discussed earlier, it's not a necessary condition. It just makes it harder. And so if you can't get the Fiscal Responsibility Act through, or if fiscal policy is still not under control, I think the central bank should still be trying to achieve its objective, and it can still achieve its objective, but it will put more pressure on interest rates clearly than it would if fiscal policy was under control. And so the fact that puts in pressure on interest rates, then that becomes more of a pressure on the government to get the fiscal house in order. And that's why, you can't just stand off all the reforms waiting for everything to happen in the right sequence. You got to get on and do the best you can and take a practical approach. And the more you succeed in one area, it creates pressure to succeed in another area.
Anushka, over to you.
Thank you, Murtaza. Professor Spencer, two quick questions. The first is, both questions are at opposite ends of the spectrum, if you will. The first is very micro and internal to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. If you could cast your mind back to the period in which those reforms were initiated and reflect on the new technical capabilities that needed to be built up as the central bank shifted the way in which it worked, whether it was, new teams, units, or skills that you recall needing to be developed at the time in order to deal with the new avatar of the central bank and the new kind of technical demands required of the new monetary policy approach. The second one is at a much more macro level and perhaps links a little bit to what the High Commissioner talked about. In your segment on sequencing of reforms, you said that the monetary reforms gave impetus to the broader reform endeavor. Could you add a little more color to that? And particularly, Murtaza at the start talked about the All Blacks. A rugby team is only as good as how the team works well. So if you were to imagine the central bank as one of other actors in economic governance of the economy, what was the relationship between this new reformed central bank and the other institutions, and also loose parallel to the spectators in that rugby match, the public? How were there any deliberate measures to get the public to understand the new remit and the new avatar of this central bank, the reasons for these reforms, so that it is anchored and isn't susceptible to shifts as political parties come in and campaign on various matters? So first question on internal, what are kind of the new technical competencies, and the other is public buy-in. Thank you.
Maybe just tackling the last one first, the public buy-in, because that is crucial to get the public buy-in, to get the political support. And the thing in common, I think, is a crisis. If you have a crisis and you run out of money, then that can create the impetus to say, well, we have no alternative. We have to act. We have to reform. We have to do something different. This last approach we've had is not working. And that's what happened in 1984 in New Zealand. And so because of the huge disruption and the crisis, and everyone saw this in the newspapers every day, then the public bought the story, and they rightly bought the story that policies had to change. And so that's why, a crisis creates that opportunity, but it has to be sort of sold properly, and it has to have a leader, a political leader, not just a public sector leader, to say, we have no alternative, this is the direction we have to take. And in New Zealand's case, as Michael said, there was David Lange, the Prime Minister, and Roger Douglas, the new Minister of Finance, that was leading the charge and saying, yeah, we have to make these reforms, put them in place. So yeah, the communications is crucial. Now, coming back to your first one on the technical capabilities, with the bank, yeah, the key areas to move to a sort of market-based monetary policy. We had to, after deregulating the financial system, we had to build and develop money markets and markets for operating to achieving control over short-term interest rates. So there was quite a rapid sort of move to establish a sort of a financial markets team, or enhance the existing financial markets team, and to establish financial instruments that could be used in the market for open market operations to affect settlement cash, to affect short-term interest rates. That all required new skills, new systems, etc. But you muddle your way through. Nothing's perfect on the first day. Sometimes you just got to jump in the water and then you find that you can swim. And as time goes on, you swim better. The other area I'm thinking of in terms of skills was, of course, in the actual forecasting of the economy, and trying to say, okay, if we have this price stability target, then what's the actual transition? What's the link back through the economic variables back to the policy instrument? And we had economic models that we'd been developing for a number of years, and those needed to improve. But again, you can never get perfection in your econometric model, but there was quite a bit of effort put in on that side of things as well. The other aspect was the All Blacks team approach, and the message has to be that all the members of the team have to pull together. But of course, they don't all pull together. They don't all pull together at the same time. And at the end of the day, the government has to take the lead and push things through where they can, take a practical approach. And that will create pressures elsewhere, which will cause pain. That pain will be an incentive to create further reform, for example, in the labour market, or in the trade or external side of things, or in agriculture. And that's just how it worked in terms of observing that the way that things were implemented. Because you can't always think of everything up front. You don't have a grand plan to start with saying, this is my wiring diagram and Gantt chart for the whole project. It just doesn't exist. You have to work and be quick on your feet and respond to the pressures when they come up, and try and push through those reforms and changes when it becomes clear that they are imperatives.
Thank you. I think Deshal Dimel has a question.
Thank you, Murtaza. Thank you for the presentation. So you made reference to the fact that in the New Zealand process there was the removal of Treasury officials from the Monetary Board. In Sri Lanka's monetary reform process, one of the debates has been that in the event of the removal of the Treasury Secretary, in this case from the Monetary Policy Board, what would be the operational mechanism for coordination between fiscal and monetary policy? So were there any kind of institutional mechanisms that were built into the New Zealand process that enabled this more kind of operational coordination? If you could maybe touch on that. And secondly, again, one of the arguments of having some flexibility from a rules-based monetary policy during a crisis. And then we saw that during the COVID experience, many countries did shift away from conventional monetary policy during that kind of extraordinary situation. Again, were there any kind of legislative or institutional processes or structures that enabled that kind of flexibility on a temporary basis to kind of tide through a crisis, and then ways in which you come back to the mean during a particular time frame? Thanks.
Well, thanks for that question. On the first one, the Secretary of Treasury was removed from the board and from monetary policy decision making, but there is still a Treasury representative as an observer who like sits in the corner or on the edge of the desk, the table, in Monetary Policy Committee to observe what's happening, and in theory to answer questions about, or how would this action affect fiscal policy, for example. Now the person is the Secretary of the Treasury, but will typically be represented by, an Assistant Secretary or someone a bit further down the chain. But the reality is that that person gives a one-way feedback to Treasury about what the bank's doing, but my understanding is there's very little two-way discussion about in MPC about how this might be a sort of a fiscal monetary coordination issue. So what really happens? There's still good communication, obviously, between Treasury and the bank, but the Treasury lets the bank know exactly what its fiscal projections are for the deficit, for its debt program, and then that information is built into the bank's forecasts, and therefore it is built into its decision making, a decision on monetary policy. And then, 3 months down the track, there'll be more different, the fiscal information will change, and so that will again feed into Reserve Bank's models and decision-making process. So it's there's not an explicit coordination because the Reserve Bank has its objective, which is price stability, and the Treasury and the government on the fiscal policy has a more medium-term objective. It does not have a counter-cyclical stabilization type objective. Now, it did have many years ago, and we talked about in the early 80s and the 70s, then fiscal policy did try to be counter-cyclical and smooth the economy, but they always got it wrong, and they got the timing wrong and made mistakes. So that's why in the reforms, the change in approach of fiscal was to be much more medium-term focus, to say, what do we need to supply the infrastructure for the economy, the education requirements, the health requirements, and move steadily to achieve those objectives rather than trying to fine-tune the economy through cyclical actions. So in a general sense, the fiscal information is a medium-term focus and a stable background. But that information, where changes do occur, will feed into the monetary policy process. Now, you mentioned the recent COVID exercise, and of course, that was a case where there was more of a coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy in New Zealand and in many other countries. But even though the central bank moved to unconventional monetary policies and adopted quantitative easing, buying all these government bonds, which made the government's running of a large fiscal deficit much easier because they could sell the bonds over the road to the central bank. In principle, and I believe in fact in the New Zealand case, the central bank still made the decision about how many bonds to buy. So the quantitative easing decision and the bond purchases were still at the discretion of the bank. Now, you know, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes of private meetings between the minister and the governor over the last couple of years, but I mean, you're right that I think in New Zealand and in other countries that sort of independence of the central bank was somewhat tested. It was tested because the governments were spending a lot of money on wage subsidies and trying to maintain incomes while everyone was staying at home under these various lockdowns. And so there was that apparent coordinated approach. But the test of whether the central bank independence has survived is now being run in that test, because you're now seeing that with inflation, the central bank has to come out and get on top of it. The central banks are stopping their QE programs and having to actually reverse the programs and sell those bonds back or let them run off. That's what's happening in New Zealand. And some other countries, I think it may be more difficult. But you're right, it's been a test of whether a central bank can really stick to its guns and stick to its price stability objective.
Thank you. On the central bank side, anybody has a question? What about the others? Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Spencer just said, I want to know, I know New Zealand has a very active parliamentary system, committee system, and which a lot of interaction. In fact, before a bill comes into Parliament, the parliamentary committees themselves have a lot of interaction. As a result, there's not much amendment on the floor or opposition. It is almost unanimous. Does the parliamentary select, what is the interaction of the central bank with the parliamentary select committee, and how that interaction fed into building up confidence in the public of the reform process? And I know that the ghost of sort of 84 pushed a lot of things in New Zealand, and so whether that sort of, and thereafter what's in interaction with the central, which Parliament has helped them to bring about reform, and that sort of.
Yeah, an interesting question. I mean, I agree that the current situation in New Zealand, the parliamentary committees are active and have played important roles in modifying, adapting legislation, and where both parties are sort of operating in the committee and having an influence. And just in terms of the central bank, the Reserve Bank's accountability to Parliament, they have to front up to the Finance and Expenditure Committee after every policy statement. So in the next day or two after the policy statement, they go over to Parliament, and the subject and the governor and deputy governor, etc., are subject to the questions from that Finance and Expenditure Committee. So, and the press is there, so it's an open meeting. So, you know, you get that element of public accountability as well. So I think it's a useful forum, and it has produced a certain amount of fireworks in recent times. But in terms of the initial reforms in the 80s, I would have to say that through that period, the Parliament did not have a huge influence on the new legislation that was really coming out in a very frequent fashion from the government. And it was really coming through cabinet. Cabinet was the driving force. And even they say, you know, within that was the mini cabinet of sort of a handful of key ministers who were really thrashing out and driving determining the shape of new legislation as it came out. And there was quite a bit of, you know, consternation in Parliament from the opposition that Parliament was not really playing a big role in that initial reform period. But you know, but as I say, in more recent times, Parliament and the select committees have been playing a bigger role.
Ilan?
Can I ask a non-central banking question? Sri Lanka has had a paucity of making evidence-based policies. However, in the central bank, we have a very strong research department. In the finance ministry, we have what's called the national planning department, who's been sort of relegated to a level of impotence. What's the experience in New Zealand in terms of mobilizing the strong knowledge base of the likes of a research department of a central bank or a planning department of a finance ministry in driving evidence-based policy making?
Wow, well, that's, yeah. I think, you know, that you've observed correctly that, you know, different groups of within the public sector can play different roles and have different degrees of power, you know, through time. And so the power of some groups, whether it's a planning agency or the Treasury or the Reserve Bank, can wax and wane, you know, through different periods, often depending on the actual individuals involved in terms of the governor and the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Commerce, yeah, other ministers as well. So in the case of the 80s, 90s reforms, the big driving forces in terms of shaping policy was mainly the Treasury, the New Zealand Treasury. And, you know, there were other sort of economic and research functions around other parts of government. But in terms of that reform process, at that point in time, Treasury was had a very strong influence. The Reserve Bank had a strong influence as well, but mainly around the monetary and financial sector reforms, the floating of the currency, etc. So we were deeply involved in those aspects. But if you're talking about the broader economic reforms, Treasury was where it was coming from. But you know, in years since, like right now, today, Treasury is a much weaker force in New Zealand policy making. So these things change through time, and often they're a function of personalities. But as you say, you would hope that they're evidence-based, and I think when they're successful, they're evidence-based, but it's not always the case.
So we are ahead of time. I normally dominate questioning, so I kept some reserve questions. So Professor Spencer, New Zealand Central Bank, can you comment about your HR system, whether you allow talent to move in to horizontal positions, Or is it about that you have to move vertically up in the organization?
It's certainly horizontal movement does happen and is encouraged. And even in my own career at the Reserve Bank, I started in the Reserve Bank of New Zealand as an econometric modeler in the sort of late 70s, and it was the big thing to build econometric models. And I had a sort of maths and economics degree, so that's where I started. But then subsequently, I moved into economic policy, and then into financial markets, and then eventually into banking regulation and supervision. And in fact, I'd moved outside the organisation, been to the IMF, and also worked at a commercial bank, at the ANZ Bank in Australia. So I guess I typified quite a significant degree of horizontal movement. And I was trying to achieve as much vertical movement as I could, but that didn't always happen. So yes, it's a flexible entity. Whether it's still that flexible today, I mean, generally the Reserve Bank, when it has a management position to fill, would be looking for someone else in the bank, either in that area or from another area or outside the bank. So often there'll be an internal and an external candidate for a role. And at least in recent times, where the bank has been expanding, because under this government, the bank's budget has expanded, there's been quite a lot of external hiring. And I'm not sure about that may have dominated the internal horizontal movement. But that's the history, is certainly, that's the tradition, is a lot of horizontal movement.
My next question is about asset price inflation. Now, in inflation targeting, my understanding is it's mainly on goods and services. Of course, there's an imputed figure for rent in the inflation calculation. But all over the world, we have had very, very high asset price inflation. You did mention to Roshan's question about housing prices. Can you weigh in on asset price inflation and how it is brought into a central bank's inflation targeting framework?
That's a very good question, and it's one that where there's quite a different approaches between the central banks, and under the initial framework of our inflation targeting regime, or flexible inflation targeting, it was the primary objective of price stability, have regard to output, employment, etc., and have regard to the efficiency and stability of the financial system. So asset prices or asset price volatility could be brought into that secondary objective. So often this is the case in New Zealand and in a number of other central banks. There'll be a secondary objective, have regard to financial stability, which allows the governor to indeed have regard to asset price inflation. So if the house prices are going up by 30%, saying we really need to have regard to this and maybe not have our foot on the accelerator so hard for monetary policy to avoid the damage that's happening from asset price escalation. But if you talk to some central banks, and if you talk to the Federal Reserve, for example, in Washington, they will say that financial stability and asset prices has no real role in monetary policy, because they have price stability and maximum sustainable employment, and for asset prices and financial variables, you use other tools. such as financial regulation. So I think my view is that asset prices are a very important factor to look at when making monetary policy decisions. But what I'm saying is that that doesn't always apply across other central banks. And indeed, it can change through time, depending on the governor and their approach to this question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Murtaza, please, something related to that question I have on the New Zealand Act, what we are looking at on the financial stability, macroprudential policy, and the microprudential. Basically, in our law, earlier central banking law, we have this regulation and supervision authority, and also we used to under same wing we have been using macroprudential instruments to address all these overall macro prudential issues. So in the new law, what we are proposing is to have a separate kind of a recognized macroprudential supervision authority in the new law, and which will have a different role to microprudential regulation and supervision of the individual banks and non-bank institutions. That is, just like to know what kind of, I guess the macroprudential asset price bubbles also is something that we need to consider under macroprudential authority or supervision rules and regulations. That I'd like to have your comments. What is your structure there? Thank you.